The morning of our 10th wedding anniversary started like any other Tuesday. Marcus rolled out of bed at exactly 6:47 a.m., same as always, padding to the bathroom without so much as a glance in my direction. I lay there watching the ceiling fan rotate lazily overhead, counting each revolution and waiting for some acknowledgement of the significance of this particular day. Nothing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'd been planning this anniversary for months. The dinner reservations at Bernardin, the weekend getaway to Martha's Vineyard, the photo album I'd painstakingly assembled featuring 10 years of our marriage milestones. Everything was arranged to perfection, ready to celebrate a decade of what I thought had been a beautiful partnership. The shower ran for exactly 12 minutes. Marcus was nothing if not predictable. I slipped into my silk robe, the sapphire blue one he'd complimented once 3 years ago, and made my way to the kitchen. Fresh coffee was already brewing, the rich aroma filling our spacious Manhattan apartment. I'd ground the beans myself. The night before, the expensive Ethiopian blend Marcus preferred, timing everything perfectly for his morning routine. "Good morning, darling," I said as he appeared in the kitchen, adjusting his Hermes tie. The same tie I'd given him for our 5th anniversary. "Sleep well?" He grunted, scrolling through his phone while pouring coffee into his travel mug. His wedding ring caught the morning light streaming through our floor-to-ceiling windows, the platinum band I'd chosen to match my own. The inscription inside read, "Forever starts today." Words that felt increasingly hollow with each passing year. I waited. Surely he would remember. Surely the man I'd married, the one who used to surprise me with flowers just because it was Wednesday, would acknowledge that today marked exactly 10 years since we'd promised to love each other forever. "I made your favorite breakfast," I offered, gesturing to the perfectly arranged plate of steel-cut oats topped with fresh berries and honey. The same breakfast I'd made him every Tuesday for the past 2 years, hoping to inject some romance into our routine. "Thanks," he muttered, eyes still glued to his screen. "Running late today. Big presentation for the Morrison account." The Morrison account. I bit my tongue to keep from pointing out that I was the one who'd strategically introduced him to Harold Morrison at last year's charity gala. That I was the one who'd researched Morrison's business interests, his family connections, his favorite restaurants and golf courses. That Marcus's brilliant networking was actually the result of my behind-the-scenes orchestration. "Of course," I smiled, the expression feeling plastic on my face. "Will you be home for dinner tonight?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He was already heading toward the door, briefcase in one hand, coffee in the other, still scrolling through what looked like stock reports. "Probably late. You know how these presentations go." "No, Marcus. I know how these presentations should go because I've been writing your talking points for 3 years. But what I said was, I understand. Have a wonderful day, sweetheart." The door closed with its familiar soft click, leaving me alone in our pristine apartment, alone on our anniversary. I stood in the kitchen for several minutes, staring at his untouched breakfast, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of Manhattan waking up 23 floors below. Through the windows, I could see other people beginning their days, joggers in Central Park, dog walkers, early commuters clutching coffee cups like lifelines. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend Sarah. "Happy anniversary, gorgeous. Can't wait to hear about tonight's celebration." I stared at the message, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. What could I say? That my husband of 10 years had forgotten our anniversary completely? That the man who claimed to love me couldn't even be bothered to acknowledge the most important date in our relationship? "Thank you" should be magical. I typed back, the lies coming easily now. The morning passed in a blur of mundane tasks designed to keep my mind occupied. I called the restaurant to confirm our 8 p.m. reservation. I picked up Marcus's dry cleaning, including the Tom Ford suit I'd specifically requested for tonight. I stopped by Tiffany & Co. to collect the vintage cufflinks I'd had engraved with our wedding date, my anniversary gift to him. At 2 p.m., I was arranging fresh peonies in a crystal vase when my phone rang. Marcus's name flashed on the screen, and my heart leaped. Finally. "Hello, darling," I answered, arranging my voice to sound casual rather than desperately hopeful. "Hey, quick question," he said without preamble. "Do you remember where I put that blue folder, the one with the Henderson contract details?" I closed my eyes, fighting back the wave of disappointment. Of course it wasn't about our anniversary. It was about work. It was always about work. "Second drawer of your desk, filed under H for Henderson," I replied automatically. I'd organized his home office 6 months ago when his assistant quit and hadn't been replaced yet. Apparently, I'd become the unpaid substitute. "Great, thanks. You're a lifesaver." The line went quiet, and I held my breath, waiting for him to remember, waiting for him to say something, anything, about the significance of today. "Marcus?" I ventured. "Yeah? Is there anything special about today?" A pause. I could hear papers shuffling in the background, the muffled sound of office chatter. "Special? I don't think so." "Why?" The words hit me like a physical blow. 10 years. 10 years of marriage, and he couldn't even be bothered to remember our anniversary. Without prompting. "Nothing important," I managed. "I'll see you tonight." Probably be late, remember? Morrison presentation. Right. Of course. After hanging up, I sat in our living room surrounded by the evidence of our life together. Wedding photos on the mantel, artwork we'd chosen together, furniture I'd carefully selected to create the perfect home for us. Everything looked exactly as it had this morning, but something fundamental had shifted. I called Le Bernardin and canceled our reservation. The rest of the afternoon, I moved through our apartment like a sleepwalker, seeing everything, with new eyes. The pristine kitchen where I cooked meals Marcus barely noticed. The bedroom where we slept side by side but rarely touched. The home office where I managed our social calendar, our finances, our entire life while he focused on his career. When had I become invisible? I thought back to our early days, when Marcus would surprise me with handwritten notes hidden in my purse, when he'd call just to hear my voice, when he'd look at me like I was the most fascinating person in the world. Somewhere along the way, I'd transformed from the love of his life into efficient household management. At 6 p.m., I opened a bottle of the Chateau Margaux we'd been saving for a special occasion. I poured myself a generous glass and stood at our windows, watching the city lights begin to twinkle as darkness fell. In the reflection of the glass, I could see myself, still beautiful at 34, still the woman Marcus had promised, to cherish forever. But when was the last time he'd really looked at me? My phone buzzed with a text. "Running really late. Don't wait up. Order takeout. My." No apology. No acknowledgement that he was missing dinner on our anniversary. Just a casual dismissal of my time, my feelings, my entire existence. I deleted the message without responding. The Chateau Margaux was excellent, rich and complex with notes of blackcurrant and cedar. I'd researched it extensively before purchasing it 3 years ago, waiting for the perfect moment to share it with my husband. Instead, I was drinking it alone while he prioritized work over our marriage. By the time Marcus's key turned in the lock at 11:47 p.m., I was sitting in the dark living room, the empty wine bottle on the coffee table beside me. He stumbled slightly as he entered, probably having celebrated his successful presentation at whatever bar his colleagues preferred these days. "Sarah?" he called softly, using the pet name he'd given me in college. "You still awake?" I didn't answer. Through the shadows, I watched him move through our apartment, loosening his tie, checking his phone one more time before heading toward the bedroom. He paused at the living room entrance, squinting into the darkness. "Sarah? Why are you sitting in the dark?" "Just thinking," I said quietly. He flipped on a lamp, and I watched him take in the scene: the empty wine bottle, my formal dress, the untouched gift box on the side table. For a moment, confusion flickered across his face. "Everything okay? You look dressed up." "Do you know what today is, Marcus?" He blinked, his exhausted mind clearly struggling to process the question. "Tuesday? What else?" A longer pause. I could almost see the gears turning, the gradual realization dawning in his eyes. "Oh, God," he breathed. "Oh, Sarah, I'm so sorry. The presentation ran late, and then Morrison wanted to celebrate, and I completely forgot." I finished for, "You completely forgot our 10th wedding anniversary." His face crumpled. "Sweetheart, I'm so sorry. I've been so stressed with this account, and there's always an account, Marcus. There's always something more important than us." He moved toward me, his expensive suit wrinkled from his long day, his hair disheveled. "That's not true. You know you're the most important thing in my life." "When?" I asked, standing up and smoothing my dress. "When was the last time you made me feel important? When was the last time you really looked at me, talked to me about something other than your schedule or your dry cleaning or your missing folders?" "Sarah, please. I know I've been distracted lately, but once this Morrison deal closes—" "There will be another deal," I interrupted. "And another client. And another reason why everything else comes before your wife." I picked up the gift box from the side table, the vintage cufflinks I'd spent weeks selecting, the ones engraved with today's date. I had our entire evening planned. Dinner reservations, a weekend getaway, gifts. I've been planning it for months. Marcus reached for the box, but I pulled it back. "No," I said firmly. "You don't get to receive gifts when you can't even remember the occasion." "Sarah, come on. I messed up, okay? I admit it. But we can celebrate tomorrow night. Or this weekend. We can make it up to me?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're going to make up for forgetting our 10th anniversary?" He ran his hands through his hair, clearly frustrated by his inability to fix this with his usual charm and promises. "What do you want me to do? I can't change what happened today." "No," I agreed, walking past him toward our bedroom. "You can't." As I reached the doorway, I turned back to look at my husband of 10 years. He stood in our living room looking lost and confused, surrounded by the evidence of the life I'd built around him. The life where I managed everything while he focused on his career. The life where I'd slowly disappeared into the background of my own marriage. "You know what the most painful part is, Marcus?" I said softly. "It's not that you forgot. It's that you don't even realize you've been forgetting me for years." I closed the bedroom door behind me, leaving him standing alone in the living room with the empty wine bottle and his regrets. That night, as I lay in our king-sized bed listening to Marcus pace the living room, I made a decision. For 10 years, I'd been the perfect wife, supportive, understanding, invisible. I'd made his life easier while mine became smaller and smaller. I'd prioritized his needs while my own went unmet. But if Marcus wanted to treat me like I was invisible, then perhaps it was time to show him what visibility really looked like. Perhaps it was time to remind my husband exactly who he'd married. Perhaps it was time to make him notice me again. The clock on my nightstand glowed 2:17 a.m. when Marcus finally came to bed, sliding under the covers with careful movements designed not to wake me. But I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling and planning my next move. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of making my husband remember that I existed. And by the time I was finished, Marcus would never be able to ignore me again. I woke before dawn the next morning with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. While Marcus slept beside me, One arm flung carelessly across the Egyptian cotton sheets I'd selected, I slipped quietly from bed and padded to my walk-in closet. The space was organized with military precision, clothes arranged by color and season, shoes lined up like soldiers, accessories sorted in velvet-lined drawers. But today, I wasn't looking for my usual understated elegance, hidden in the back corner, behind the conservative blazers and modest dresses that had become my uniform as Marcus's wife, hung the remnants of who I used to be. The red Valentino dress I'd worn to our engagement party, the black Saint Laurent suit that had made me feel invincible during my last job interview, the emerald green silk blouse that once prompted a stranger to tell me I looked like a movie star. I selected the emerald blouse and paired it with a fitted black skirt that accentuated curves I'd forgotten I had. In my jewelry box, beneath the pearls Marcus's mother had given me, I found the vintage Cartier watch my grandmother had left. Me, bold, distinctive, and utterly confident. The woman staring back at me in the mirror looked familiar yet foreign. This was Sarah before she became Mrs. Marcus Wellington. This was the woman who'd graduated summa cum laude from Columbia, who'd once been described by a professor as brilliantly unpredictable, who'd turned down 3 job offers to marry the calm man sleeping in my bed. I applied makeup with deliberate precision, a smoky eye that made my hazel eyes look mysterious, lipstick the exact shade of my blouse. My hair, usually pulled back in a conservative chignon, fell in loose waves around my shoulders. Marcus stirred as I closed the closet door. Through the reflection in my vanity mirror, I watched him blink awake, his face creased with pillow marks and guilt from the night before. "Sarah?" His voice was thick with sleep and uncertainty. "You're up early." I turned to face him, and I saw the exact moment he registered my appearance. His eyes widened slightly, taking in the transformation from invisible wife to the woman he'd fallen in love with a decade ago. "Good morning, darling," I said, my voice carrying a new note of confidence. "I have an early appointment." "An appointment?" He sat up, running his hands through his disheveled hair. "What kind of appointment?" I smiled mysteriously, applying perfume to my pulse points, not the subtle vanilla scent I'd worn for years, but the bold jasmine fragrance I'd abandoned. When Marcus once mentioned it was a bit much for daytime. "Just something I need to take care of," I replied, slipping on my heels. "Don't worry about breakfast this morning. I'll grab something out." Marcus scrambled out of bed, suddenly very awake. "Sarah, wait. About last night?" "What about it?" I asked innocently, checking my reflection one final time. "I want to make it up to you. The anniversary thing. Maybe we could do dinner tonight? Somewhere special?" I paused, meeting his eyes in the mirror. The desperation there was almost satisfying. Almost. "I'm sorry, Marcus, but I have plans tonight." "Plans?" The word came out sharper than he intended. "What plans?" "Does it matter?" I turned to face him fully, noting how his gaze kept drifting to my appearance, as if he couldn't quite believe this was his wife. "You made it clear yesterday that my schedule isn't particularly important." Before he could respond, I was already heading for the door. "Have a wonderful day, sweetheart. Don't wait up tonight." The first stop in my strategic campaign was the Salon Laurent on Fifth Avenue. I'd discovered the exclusive establishment, too, years ago while waiting for Marcus at a nearby restaurant, but I'd never allowed myself the indulgence. Today, that changed. "I'd like the full treatment," I told Veronique, the salon's premier stylist. "Hair, nails, the works. I have a very important day ahead of me." 3 hours later, I emerged transformed. My hair was styled in soft, sophisticated layers that caught the light with every movement. My nails were painted in a deep burgundy that complemented my skin tone perfectly. I looked like a woman who invested in herself, who valued her own worth. My phone buzzed as I walked down Fifth Avenue, a text from Marcus. "Where are you? Called the house and you weren't there?" I deleted the message without responding. The next phase required careful timing. I knew Marcus's schedule as well as my own. Better, actually, since I'd been managing it for years. His lunch meeting with the Peterson group was at Le Bernardin, the same restaurant where we should have celebrated our anniversary. The irony was delicious. I arrived 15 minutes before his reservation, taking a table with a clear view of the entrance. The maitre d' recognized me from our previous visits and seated me at one of the best tables in the house. I ordered a glass of their finest Sancerre and settled in to wait. Marcus walked in at exactly 12:45, accompanied by two men in expensive suits. I watched his confident stride, the way he commanded attention without effort, the easy smile he reserved for business associates. This was Marcus in his element, the successful attorney who could charm anyone when it served his purposes. I waited until he was seated before standing up and walking toward the ladies' room, ensuring my path would take me directly past his table. Sarah? His voice was sharp with surprise. I turned, my expression one of mild curiosity, as if I hadn't orchestrated this entire encounter. Marcus, what a lovely surprise. I smiled at his companions. Gentlemen, I hope you're enjoying your lunch. The two men, Peterson and his associate, based on their photos in the business journals I'd studied, looked between Marcus and me with obvious interest. Marcus's discomfort was palpable. You didn't mention you'd be in the neighborhood, Marcus stammered. Didn't I? I touched his shoulder lightly, noting how he jumped at the contact. I'm meeting a friend for lunch. You remember Diana Rothschild? She's in from Paris. I watched the recognition flicker in Marcus's eyes. Diana was a wildly successful art dealer, old money, the kind of woman who moved in circles Marcus desperately wanted to access. The kind of woman I'd grown up with but had distanced myself from after our marriage. Diana's here? The hunger in his voice was unmistakable. We're catching up on old times, I said vaguely. Anyway, I don't want to interrupt your business. Nice meeting you, gentlemen. I continued toward the ladies' room, feeling Marcus's eyes burning into my back. When I returned 10 minutes later, I could see him stealing glances in my direction, while trying to maintain focus on his meeting. My phone buzzed. Since when are you friends with Diana Rothschild again? This time, I responded. Since always. She never stopped being my friend, Marcus. I just stopped mentioning her. 20 minutes later, Diana actually arrived. I'd called her that morning, explaining I needed to have lunch with an old friend. She'd been delighted, curious about my sudden reappearance in her social sphere after years of polite but distant contact. Darling! Diana embraced me warmly, her Hermes scarf and perfectly tailored Chanel suit drawing admiring glances from other diners. You look absolutely radiant and mysterious. I love the new energy. We were seated at a table with a perfect view of Marcus's increasingly agitated attempts to focus on his business lunch while watching our animated conversation. Diana regaled me with stories of her latest gallery opening in London, dropping names of celebrities and royalty with casual familiarity. You simply must come to the Venetian exhibition next month, she insisted, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Prince Alessandro will be there, and he specifically asked about you after seeing that photo from the charity auction. I caught Marcus choking slightly on his wine from across the room. Which photo? I asked, though I knew exactly which one. She meant the one from the Mets fundraiser last year. You looked absolutely stunning in that silver gown. He said you reminded him of Grace Kelly. The silver gown Marcus had complained was too flashy for a charity event. The same gown I'd returned to the closet unworn after his criticism. You'll have to give me the details, I said, deliberately not looking in Marcus's direction despite feeling his stare. Diana leaned forward conspiratorially. I hope you don't mind me asking, but you seem different. More like the Sarah I knew in college. What's changed? I sipped my wine, considering my words carefully. I think I've just remembered who I used to be. before I started worrying about what other people wanted me to be. After lunch, Diana and I made plans to meet for dinner the following week. She pressed her business card into my hand, the heavy stock paper embossed with her gallery's logo. "Promise me you'll consider working with me again," she said as we hugged goodbye. "Your eye for emerging artists was always exceptional. I could use someone with your instincts." As Diana's car pulled away, I felt a presence behind me. Marcus had apparently cut his business lunch short. "That was interesting," he said, trying to sound casual. "What was?" I adjusted my purse strap, noting how his eyes tracked the movement. "Running into Diana Rothschild. Small world." "Not really. We have lunch regularly." Another small lie, but delivered with perfect confidence. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Since when?" "Since always, Marcus. You've just never asked about my friendships." I could see him struggling with this new information, trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with the wife who'd spent years managing his schedule and organizing his life. "Where are you going now?" he asked as I began walking toward Fifth Avenue. "Shopping," I replied truthfully. "For what?" I turned to face him, noting the way his expensive suit seemed less impressive in daylight, how the confidence he wore so easily in business settings appeared to be slipping. "For things I want, Marcus. Novel concept, isn't it?" The afternoon was spent in a strategic shopping expedition that would have made Sun Tzu proud. I visited 3 boutiques where I knew the sales associates remembered me from previous visits. With Marcus. At each stop, I purchased something beautiful and completely impractical: a cashmere scarf in peacock blue, a vintage brooch that cost more than most people's monthly salary, a pair of shoes that made my legs look incredible. But the real strategy was in the timing. I knew Marcus would call these places eventually, curious about my sudden spending. I made sure each purchase was memorable, each interaction noticed. At Bergdorf Goodman, I ran into Clarissa Vandenberg, wife of one of Marcus's most important clients. She did a double-take when she saw me. "Sarah Wellington, you look absolutely divine. That color is spectacular on you." We chatted for 20 minutes about her upcoming charity gala, the one Marcus had been angling for an invitation to for months. As we talked, I mentioned my interest in getting more involved with philanthropic work. "We desperately need someone with your background on our planning committee," Clarissa gushed. "Would you consider it? The time commitment isn't overwhelming, and the networking opportunities are incredible." I accepted graciously, knowing the invitation would reach Marcus's ears within hours. By 6 o'clock, I was home, but not for long. I'd made dinner reservations at 11 Madison Park, alone. It was the kind of restaurant where being seen mattered, where the right table could change your social standing. I dressed carefully for dinner, the black Saint Laurent suit with a silk camisole underneath, statement jewelry that caught the light, my grandmother's vintage clutch. I looked like a woman who belonged in the finest restaurants, who commanded attention and respect. Marcus was waiting in the living room when I emerged, still in his work clothes but with his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up. He'd clearly been pacing. "Where are you going dressed like that?" The question came out more accusatory than he probably intended. "To dinner," I replied, checking my lipstick in the hallway mirror. "With who?" "Myself." He stared at me as if I'd announced my intention to fly to the moon. "You're going to dinner alone? At a restaurant?" "Why not? I enjoy my own company. Very stimulating conversation." "Sarah, this is ridiculous. We need to talk. About yesterday, about us. I feel like I don't even know you anymore." I paused at the door, my hand on the handle. "That's the point, Marcus. You stopped knowing me years ago. You just didn't notice until now." The dinner at 11 Madison Park was exquisite. I was seated at a prime table with a view of the entire dining room, and I ordered the chef's tasting menu with wine pairings. The sommelier was particularly attentive, clearly enjoying the opportunity to educate someone who appreciated fine wine. Halfway through the meal, My phone buzzed with calls and texts from Marcus. I let them go to voicemail, focusing instead on the incredible saffron risotto and the fascinating conversation I was having with the couple at the adjacent table about contemporary art. When I finally listened to Marcus's messages around 10 p.m., his voice progressed from confused to frustrated to genuinely worried. "Sarah, please call me back. I don't understand what's happening here. This silent treatment isn't like you. We can work through whatever this is." "Okay, I'm starting to get concerned. Just text me that you're okay?" I texted back a single word. "Fine." I arrived home at 11:30 to find Marcus waiting in the living room, still in his work clothes, looking haggard and confused. "Where were you?" he demanded the moment I walked through the door. "I told you. Dinner. For 4 hours?" Good food takes time to appreciate. I set my purse on the console table, noting how his eyes tracked my every movement. "How was your evening?" "Miserable," he said honestly. "Sarah, what's going on? Yesterday you were upset about the anniversary thing, which I get, but today you're like a completely different person." I turned to face him fully, studying the man I'd married 10 years ago. He looked genuinely distressed, off balance in a way I hadn't seen since his early days as a junior associate. "I'm exactly the same person I've always been, Marcus. I'm just not hiding it anymore." "Hiding what?" "The parts of myself you never seemed interested in." He ran his hands through his hair, clearly frustrated. "That's not fair. I'm interested in you." "When?" The question hung in the air between us. When was the last time you asked me about my day and actually listened to the answer? When was the last time you noticed I'd changed my hair or bought something new? When was the last time you saw me as anything other than the person who manages your life? Marcus opened and closed his mouth several times, clearly struggling to find an answer that wouldn't damn him further. "I've been busy," he said finally, the excuse sounding weak even to his own ears. "We've all been busy, Marcus. The difference is that I made time for you. I made you a priority. Apparently that was a mistake." I moved toward the stairs, then paused. "Oh, and you'll be interested to know that Clarissa Vandenberg invited me to join the committee for the Metropolitan Arts Gala, the one you've been hoping to attend." The shock on his face was almost comical. "Clarissa Vandenberg talked to you?" "We ran into each other today. Lovely woman. Very impressed with my knowledge of contemporary art." I smiled sweetly. "Good night, Marcus." As I climbed the stairs, I could feel his stare burning into my back. Phase 1 of my campaign was complete. I'd shattered his comfortable assumption that I would always be there, waiting patiently for whatever scraps of attention he chose to give me. Tomorrow, Phase 2 would begin, and by the time I was finished, Marcus would understand exactly what he'd been taking for granted all these years. The sound of Marcus's alarm at 6:47 a.m. no longer had the power to wake me. I'd been up since 5, returning from a sunrise yoga class in Central Park that I'd discovered through Diana's recommendation. The instructor, a serene woman named Lotus, had immediately recognized something in me that needed nurturing. "You have the aura of someone reclaiming her power," she'd said after class, her knowing smile making me wonder if my transformation was as obvious as it felt. I was already dressed and applying lipstick when Marcus stumbled into the bathroom, his routine thrown off by my early departure. Through the mirror, I watched him try to process the sight of me in fitted leggings and a designer sports bra. My hair pulled back in a high ponytail that made me look younger, more vibrant. "You went to the gym?" he asked, confusion evident in his morning voice. "Yoga," I corrected, applying mascara with practiced precision. "I've joined a class." "Since when do you do yoga?" I met his eyes in the mirror, noting the way his gaze lingered on my exposed midriff. When had my husband last seen me in anything more revealing than flannel pajamas? "Since I decided to prioritize my physical and mental well-being," I replied, capping the mascara tube with a decisive click. Marcus moved to the shower, but I could feel him watching me as I gathered my things. Will you be home for dinner tonight? No, I said simply, not offering further explanation. Sarah. His voice carried a note of frustration that was becoming increasingly familiar. We need to talk. Really talk. I feel like you're slipping away from me. I turned to face him fully, taking in his rumpled appearance, the uncertainty in his eyes. I'm not slipping away, Marcus. I'm just not waiting around anymore. Before he could respond, I was gone, leaving him standing in our bathroom with questions he was finally learning to ask. The morning was dedicated to phase 2 of my strategic reinvention, professional resurrection. I'd made an appointment with Catherine Chen, the premier headhunter in Manhattan's art world. Her office overlooked Madison Avenue, all glass and chrome and carefully curated modern pieces that screamed success. Sarah Wellington, Catherine said, rising from behind her minimalist desk. I have to admit, when you called yesterday, I was intrigued. Your reputation in the art world was quite impressive before you stepped back. Before I disappeared into marriage, she meant, but was too polite to say directly. I'm ready to step forward again, I replied, settling into the chair across from her desk. I understand you have some interesting opportunities available. Catherine pulled out a tablet, her fingers dancing across the screen. The Whitmore Museum is looking for a new curator of contemporary art. The Morgan Library needs a director of special exhibitions. And there's a fascinating opportunity with the Venetian Cultural Foundation. They're establishing a New York office. Each position represented not just a career, but a declaration of independence. For 10 years, I'd defined myself through Marcus's achievements, his social circle, his ambitions. Today, that changed. Tell me about the Venetian position, I said, leaning forward with genuine interest. It's perfect for someone with your background, Catherine explained, her enthusiasm growing. They need someone who understands both American and European art markets, someone with connections on both sides of the Atlantic. The compensation package is substantial. We spent an hour discussing possibilities, Catherine making calls to contacts who remembered my work from a decade ago. The art world, it seemed, had been waiting for my return. I can have interviews set up by next week, Catherine promised as our meeting concluded. The community is smaller than people think. Your reputation preceded you. Walking down Madison Avenue afterward, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Lunch today? I replied, in meetings all day. Which was true. My next appointment was at the Russian Tea Room with Elena Volkov, a gallery owner whose space on the Upper East Side showcased emerging Eastern European artists. We'd met years ago at a charity auction, and she'd reached out after hearing through the art world grapevine that I was re-emerging. Darling, Elena embraced me warmly, her Russian accent lending drama to everything she said. You look magnificent. Like a phoenix rising from suburban ashes. Elena had never been one for subtlety. Over blinis and champagne, she offered me something unexpected, a partnership. I've been watching the market for someone like you, she explained, her dark eyes intense. Someone with your eye, your connections, your, how do you say, hunger for beautiful things. The proposal was audacious. Co-ownership of a new gallery space in Chelsea, focusing on contemporary artists who bridge traditional and modern techniques. The kind of cutting-edge work that commanded attention from collectors worldwide. I would need significant creative control, I said, already envisioning the possibilities. Naturally, equal partners, equal say. Elena raised her champagne flute. To new beginnings and old friendships. As we toasted, I caught sight of my reflection in the restaurant's ornate mirrors. The woman looking back was confident, engaged, alive in a way I'd forgotten was possible. My phone buzzed again. Marcus. Where are you? Tried calling twice. I silenced the phone without responding. The afternoon brought an unexpected encounter that would prove more significant than I initially realized. While browsing through Sotheby's preview exhibition for their upcoming contemporary art auction, I literally bumped into someone from my past. Sarah Hartwell? The voice was warm, cultured, with just a hint of a British accent. I turned to find myself face-to-face with James Ashworth, a museum director I'd worked with on several exhibitions. Before my marriage, he was older now, silver threading through his dark hair, but his smile was exactly as I remembered, intelligent and slightly mischievous. "It's Sarah Wellington now," I corrected automatically, then wondered why I'd felt the need to make the distinction. "Of course. I heard about your marriage to Marcus Wellington. Lucky man." His eyes studied my face with the same intensity he'd once brought to analyzing Renaissance paintings. "I have to say, you look radiant. Life has been treating you well." We fell into easy conversation, walking through the exhibition together. James's knowledge was encyclopedic, his observations sharp and often amusing. I found myself laughing, genuinely for the first time in months. "This piece reminds me of that discussion we had about negative space in contemporary sculpture," he said, gesturing to a provocative installation. "You argued that emptiness could be more powerful than presence." I was surprised he remembered. "You thought I was being pretentious." "I thought you were brilliant," he corrected. "I still do. Which brings me to something interesting. I'm curating a major exhibition for the Whitney next spring. Contemporary artists exploring themes of identity and transformation. I could use someone with your expertise as a consultant." The offer hung in the air between us, loaded with possibility and the unspoken history of our past collaboration. James had always seen potential in me that others missed, had pushed me to trust my instincts when I doubted myself. "I'd need to know more details," I said carefully. "Dinner tomorrow? I can show you the preliminary plans." His invitation was professional, but the way he looked at me suggested deeper currents. "I'll consider it," I replied, pulling out my phone to check the time. 6:30. Marcus would be wondering where I was, what I was doing, who I was with. The thought was surprisingly liberating. Wonderful. James handed me his card, his fingers brushing mine briefly. "I hope you'll say yes, Sarah. The art world has missed you." As I walked home through Central Park, James's words echoed in my mind. The art world had missed me. When had Marcus last said anything that made me feel valued for who I was, rather than what I did for him? I arrived home to find Marcus pacing the living room, his phone pressed to his ear. He was clearly in work mode, but he ended the call abruptly when he saw me. "There you are," he said, relief evident in his voice. I was starting to worry. "Why?" I asked, setting down my purse and removing my coat. "I told you I had meetings." "What kind of meetings?" The question came out more demanding than he probably intended. I studied my husband's face, noting the tension around his eyes, the way his shoulders held stress. When had he started looking so brittle? "The kind where people value my professional opinion," I said finally. Marcus's jaw tightened. "Sarah, this mysterious act is getting old. Can't you just tell me what's going on?" "I'm rediscovering myself," I replied honestly. "I'm remembering who I was before I became your wife." "Before you became my wife?" His voice rose slightly. "You make it sound like marriage to me was some kind of prison sentence." I considered his words carefully. "Not prison, Marcus. More like voluntary disappearance." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken accusations and realizations. Marcus seemed to be processing something, his expression cycling through confusion, hurt, and finally, recognition. "Is this about the anniversary?" he asked quietly. "Because I've been thinking about that, and I want to make it right." "This isn't about one forgotten date," I interrupted. "This is about 10 years of forgotten everything else." Before he could respond, my phone rang. Diana's name flashed on the screen. "I should take this," I said, answering the call. "Diana, darling." "Sarah, sweetest news." Diana's voice was musical with excitement. "The Prince Alessandro exhibition I mentioned? He specifically requested that you be involved in the New York presentation. Apparently, he remembered you from the Met Gala and was quite taken with your insights on postmodern European sculpture." I was aware of Marcus watching me intently as I spoke with Diana, his expression growing more strained with each passing moment. "That's incredibly flattering," I replied. "I'd be honored to be involved." "Marvelous! Can you meet us for drinks tomorrow? The prince will be at the Carlisle with his cultural attaché. 7 o'clock? I glanced at Marcus, noting his poorly concealed panic. "I'll be there." After ending the call, the silence stretched between us again. Marcus looked like a man watching his wife transform into someone he didn't recognize. "Prince Alessandro?" he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "A client of Diana's gallery. Lovely man, very cultured." I moved toward the stairs, then paused. "Oh, I should mention, I'm considering taking on some consulting work again. In the art world." "Consulting work?" Marcus followed me toward the staircase. "Sarah, you haven't worked in 10 years. "Exactly," I said, turning to face him from the second step, which gave me a slight height advantage. "Don't you think it's time?" "But you don't need to work. We're perfectly comfortable financially." "This isn't about money, Marcus. It's about purpose, identity, self-worth." I paused, letting each word sink in. Concepts that might be foreign to someone who's never had to question their value. The barb hit its mark. Marcus's face flushed slightly. "That's not fair, isn't it?" I continued up the stairs, then called back over my shoulder. "I'll be having dinner out tomorrow night. Business meeting." In our bedroom, I could hear Marcus moving around downstairs, probably pouring himself a drink and trying to make sense of the woman his wife had become. The woman she'd always been, actually, just buried under years of accommodation and self-denial. Opened my laptop and began researching the Whitney exhibition James had mentioned. Within minutes, I was lost in the world I'd abandoned. Artists who challenged conventions, pieces that sparked controversy, the endless dialogue between creation and interpretation that had once been my passion. My phone buzzed with a text. From James. "I hope you'll consider the dinner tomorrow. I think you'll find the project fascinating." For the first time in years, someone was interested in my mind rather than my ability to organize their life. I typed back, "I accept." "Looking forward to it." As I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at me was someone I was just beginning to recognize again. Confident, purposeful, engaged with the world beyond the narrow confines of her marriage. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to reclaim the life I'd given up for love. Marcus was finally paying attention, but not for the reasons he thought. He was watching his wife disappear, not realizing that she was actually becoming visible again for the first time in a decade. The real question was whether the woman I was becoming would still want the marriage I'd been settling for. As I drifted off to sleep, I could hear Marcus moving restlessly in the guest room, where he'd apparently decided to spend the night. Good. Let him lie awake wondering what tomorrow would bring. Let him finally understand what it felt like to be uncertain about where he stood with the person he claimed to love. The morning brought an unexpected gift. Marcus had left for work without his usual goodbye kiss, but he'd forgotten his lucky cufflinks, the ones he wore to every important presentation. The same cufflinks I'd given him for our 3rd anniversary, engraved with his initials in elegant script. I held them in my palm, feeling their weight, remembering the pride in his eyes when he'd first worn them. How many times had he asked me to find them when he was running late? How many mornings had I seamlessly managed his life while he focused on more important things? Today, I placed them back in his jewelry box and didn't call to remind him. My phone was already buzzing with messages by the time I finished my morning coffee. Catherine Chen had worked her magic overnight. 3 interviews scheduled for next week, her text read. The Whitmore wants to meet Monday, Morgan Library Tuesday, and the Venetian Foundation Thursday. Also received an interesting call about you from the Whitney. Word is spreading. I smiled, feeling the familiar thrill of being wanted for my expertise, rather than my ability to coordinate dinner parties. My second message was from Elena, confirming our meeting with the Chelsea Gallery space owner that afternoon. The third was from James, detailing the dinner location and expressing his excitement about showing me the Whitney exhibition plans. But it was the fourth message that made me pause. Mrs. Wellington, this is Victoria Sterling from Town & Country magazine. We understand you're re-emerging in the art world after a brief hiatus. We'd love to discuss a feature article about women reclaiming their careers. Could we schedule an interview? A feature in Town & Country, the kind of press that opened doors and established reputations. The kind of attention Marcus craved but rarely achieved despite his successful law practice. I was typing my response when Marcus called. Sarah, I can't find my cufflinks anywhere. His voice was tight with stress. I have the Morrison presentation in 2 hours, and I've torn the house apart. Have you checked your jewelry box? I asked innocently. Of course I checked my jewelry box. They're not there. I walked to his dresser and opened the wooden box, spotting the cufflinks immediately in their usual spot. They're right here, Marcus. A pause. That's impossible. I looked there 3 times. Perhaps you're more distracted than you realize, I suggested. They're exactly where they always are. The silence on the other end spoke volumes. Marcus was coming undone, his carefully ordered life disrupted by his wife's transformation from invisible assistant to independent woman. Can you bring them to my office? He asked finally. I'm sorry, but I have appointments all day, I replied, examining my manicure. I'm sure you can manage without them. After all, your success shouldn't depend on a pair of cufflinks. Another pause. Sarah, what's happening to us? The question hung in the air, loaded with 10 years of unexamined assumptions and neglected intimacy. We're discovering who we really are when we're not performing our usual roles, I said finally. It's quite enlightening. The Chelsea Gallery space exceeded my expectations. Located in a converted warehouse with soaring ceilings and perfect, natural light, it screamed potential. Elena stood in the center of the empty space, her arms spread wide like a conductor preparing for a symphony. Can you see it? She asked, her Russian accent making everything sound dramatic. The walls lined, with pieces that challenge, that provoke, that make people question their assumptions about beauty and meaning. I could see it. More than that, I could feel it. The electricity of discovery, the thrill of introducing unknown artists to collectors who could change their lives, the satisfaction of building something meaningful from nothing. The lease? Terms? I asked, my business mind engaging despite my artistic enthusiasm. Surprisingly reasonable. The owner is more interested in cultural contribution than maximum profit. Elena handed me a folder of documents. Your initial investment would be modest, but your creative input would be substantial. We spent 2 hours walking through the space, discussing layout, lighting, the kinds of exhibitions that would establish our reputation. Elena had already identified several promising artists, a sculptor from Prague whose work explored themes of displacement, a painter from Kiev whose abstract pieces captured the chaos of modern life, a photographer from Budapest who documented the intersection of tradition and change. We would need a grand opening that creates buzz, I mused, already envisioning the possibilities. Something that attracts serious collectors and influential critics. I have an idea about that, Elena said, her smile mysterious. But first, you must decide if you're truly ready to step back into this world. It's demanding, competitive, sometimes ruthless. As we stood in that empty space, surrounded by possibility and potential. I felt more alive than I had in years. This wasn't about proving anything to Marcus or seeking his attention. This was about reclaiming a part of myself I'd thought was lost forever. "I'm ready," I said, and meant it. The afternoon brought an unexpected encounter that would shift the dynamics even further. While having coffee with Elena to finalize our gallery partnership details, I noticed a familiar figure at a nearby table. Victoria Morrison, Harold Morrison's wife and one of Manhattan's most influential socialites. Sarah Wellington? Victoria approached our table, her smile bright but calculating. "I thought that was you. You look absolutely radiant." Victoria Morrison was the kind of woman who made networking look like casual friendship while never forgetting a useful connection. Her husband's business dealings with Marcus had brought us together at numerous social events, but we'd never moved beyond polite pleasantries. "Victoria, how lovely to see you," I replied, standing to air-kiss her cheeks. "This is Elena Volkov, a dear friend and business partner." The phrase, business partner, seemed to register immediately in Victoria's sharp mind. She studied Elena, with new interest, clearly calculating the social and professional implications. "How fascinating," Victoria said, settling into an empty chair without invitation. "I had no idea you were involved in business, Sarah. Marcus never mentioned it." "Marcus doesn't know everything about my life," I replied smoothly. "Elena and I are opening a contemporary art gallery in Chelsea, very cutting-edge work." Victoria's eyes lit up with genuine interest. "How marvelous! Harold and I have been looking for fresh investment opportunities in the art world. The traditional auction houses are becoming so predictable." Within minutes, Victoria was asking detailed questions about our plans, our artists, our vision for the gallery space. Elena, reading the room perfectly, began describing our upcoming exhibitions with passionate detail. "We're planning a spectacular opening," Elena explained. "Something that will establish us immediately as a serious force in the contemporary art world." "I'd love to be involved," Victoria said, leaning forward eagerly. "Perhaps Harold and I could host a preview party? Our Upper East Side townhouse would be perfect for introducing your artist to the right collectors." The offer was more than generous, it was transformational. Victoria Morrison's parties were legendary, attended by everyone who mattered in New York's cultural and business elite. An endorsement from her could establish our gallery's reputation overnight. "That's incredibly generous," I said, maintaining my composure despite my excitement. "We'd be honored." As Victoria gathered her things to leave, she paused. "Sarah, I have to say, there's something different about you lately. You seem more substantial. It's quite attractive." After she left, Elena stared at me with newfound respect. "Do you realize what just happened? Victoria Morrison doesn't offer to host parties for unknown galleries. She sees something in you." I thought about Marcus, who'd been courting the Morrison account for months, doing everything possible to impress Harold Morrison while completely missing the opportunity sitting at his own dinner table. "Perhaps she recognizes authenticity when she sees it," I replied. That evening, I prepared for dinner with James with the same care I'd once reserved for important social events with Marcus. The black Armani dress was sophisticated without being overly formal, the jewelry subtle but expensive. I looked like a woman who belonged in the kind of restaurant where business was conducted over wine and meaningful conversations. James was waiting at our table when I arrived at Le Coucou, studying the exhibition portfolio spread before him. He looked up as I approached, his expression shifting from professional focus to something more personal. "Sarah?" He stood to greet me, his hand lingering on my arm as he kissed my cheek. "You look stunning. Success agrees with you." The portfolio was remarkable. Contemporary artists exploring themes of identity, transformation, and rediscovery. Each piece told a story about finding authentic self in a world that demanded conformity. "This work speaks to something universal," I said, studying a particularly striking sculpture. "The courage to become who you really are," regardless of others' expectations. James's eyes never left my face as I spoke. That's exactly what I hoped you'd see. Your insight was always exceptional, but now, there's something deeper, more personal. The conversation flowed as naturally as the wine, moving from professional analysis to philosophical discussion to something approaching intimacy. James was exactly as I remembered. Brilliant, passionate about art, genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions. "I've missed this," he said during a pause in our conversation. "Having someone who understands the work on this level." "I've missed being understood," I replied, then immediately regretted the revelation. James leaned forward slightly. "Are you happy, Sarah? In your marriage, I mean?" The question hung between us, loaded with implication. I thought about Marcus, probably working late again, probably not even noticing I wasn't home for dinner. "I'm learning what happiness means to me," I said carefully. "It's been educational." My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Where are you? Coming home soon?" I silenced the phone without responding. "The Whitney exhibition would run for 4 months," James continued, pulling out a detailed timeline. "Your involvement would be substantial, helping select pieces, writing catalog essays, participating in panel discussions. It would reestablish your reputation definitively." The opportunity was everything I'd dreamed of professionally. Working with James again, returning to the world where my expertise was valued, rebuilding the career I'd abandoned for love. "What about timing?" I asked, studying the schedule. "We'd start immediately. The work would be intensive, collaborative." He paused, letting the implications settle. "We'd be spending considerable time together." I met his eyes, understanding. The subtext. James was offering more than professional collaboration. He was offering an alternative to the life I'd been living. "I'll need to consider all the implications," I said finally. "Of course. But Sarah?" He reached across the table, his fingers briefly touching mine. "Don't let fear keep you from reclaiming your life. You're too extraordinary to remain hidden." As our dinner concluded, James walked me to the street corner where my car was waiting. The October evening was crisp, the city alive with energy and possibility. "Thank you for tonight," I said as we paused beside my car. "For the opportunity, and for reminding me who I used to be." "You're not who you used to be," James replied, studying my face in the streetlight. "You're who you're becoming, and that woman is remarkable." The drive home gave me time to process the evening's developments. In one day, I'd secured a gallery partnership, gained the support of one of Manhattan's most influential socialites, and been offered a career-defining opportunity. More importantly, I'd been reminded what it felt like to be valued for my mind, rather than my ability to manage someone else's life. I arrived home to find Marcus waiting in the living room, a glass of scotch in his hand and anxiety written across his face. "How was your business dinner?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Productive," I replied, removing my coat. "Very productive." "With whom?" I paused, considering how much to reveal. "James Ashworth from the Whitney Museum. He's offered me a consulting position on a major exhibition." Marcus's glass stopped halfway to his lips. "James Ashworth? The curator you used to work with?" "The very one." He remembered my work fondly. The silence that followed was charged with unspoken questions and growing suspicions. Marcus sat down, his glass, and studied my face as if seeing me for the first time. "Sarah, I need to understand what's happening here. In the span of a week, you've completely changed. You're different. You're unavailable. You're making decisions without discussing them with me." I settled into the chair across from him, noting how the distance between us seemed to have grown exponentially in recent days. "I'm making decisions about my own life, Marcus. Something I haven't done in 10 years. "Our life," he corrected. "We're married." We're supposed to make decisions together. When? The question came out sharper than I intended. When have we ever made decisions together? You decide and I accommodate. You plan and I execute. You want and I provide. Marcus leaned forward, his expression earnest. That's not how I see our marriage. No, I agreed. You don't see it at all. That's the problem. The evening ended with us sleeping in separate rooms again, the emotional distance between us growing as wide as the physical space. As I lay in our bed alone, I thought about James's words. Don't let fear keep you from reclaiming your life. Fear wasn't the issue anymore. The question was whether the life I was reclaiming had room for a husband who was just now learning to see me. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new tests of just how far I was willing to go to rediscover myself. Marcus was finally paying attention, but perhaps too late to matter. The morning of my Whitmore Museum interview, I discovered Marcus had been conducting his own investigation. His laptop was open on the kitchen counter, browser tabs revealing searches for James Ashworth Whitney Museum, Elena Volkov Gallery, and most tellingly, Sarah Hartwell Art Curator, Columbia. My maiden name. He was researching his own wife's past. Find anything interesting? I asked, appearing in the doorway with my coffee. Marcus startled, quickly closing the laptop, his face flushed with embarrassment and something approaching guilt. I was just trying to understand, he said, defensively. You're involved with all these people I've never heard of, taking meetings, making decisions. I feel like I'm married to a stranger. I studied his face, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the tension in his jaw. You are married to a stranger. Marcus, the question is whether you're interested in getting to know her. Of course I'm interested, he said quickly. But you're not making it easy. You disappear for hours, come home late, refuse to tell me where you've been or who you're with. I've told you exactly where I've been, I corrected, adjusting the collar of my tailored Chanel suit. Gallery meetings, professional dinners, interviews. The same way you tell me you're at the office or in meetings. The difference is, you've never needed my permission before. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Permission? Sarah, I'm not asking for permission. I'm asking for partnership, for inclusion in your life. The irony was breathtaking. Inclusion in my life? Marcus, when was the last time you included me in yours? When was the last time you asked my opinion about anything that mattered to you? Before he could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from Catherine Chen. Car will be there in 10 minutes. Whitmore team very excited to meet you. You've got this. I have to go, I said, gathering my portfolio and purse. I have an interview. For what position? Marcus asked, following me toward the door. Curator of Contemporary Art at the Whitmore Museum. I paused, watching his expression shift from confusion to recognition to something approaching panic. It's a significant role. 6-figure salary, international travel, considerable autonomy. You're applying for jobs? The question came out strangled. Without discussing it with me? I turned to face him fully, noting how small he looked in his expensive pajamas, how lost he seemed without his usual armor of suits and confidence. I'm applying. For my life back, Marcus. 10 years ago, I had a career, ambitions, professional relationships. I gave all of that up to support your dreams. Now I'm reclaiming mine. The Whitmore Museum's contemporary wing was everything I remembered and more. Soaring white walls showcased rotating exhibitions of cutting-edge work, each piece carefully, positioned to maximize impact and encourage dialogue. As I walked through the galleries with the interview committee, I felt like I was coming home. Your insights on the intersection of European and American contemporary movements are exactly what we need, said Dr. Margaret Sinclair, the museum's director. Your graduate thesis on postmodern sculpture was groundbreaking. We've been waiting for you to return to the field. The interview lasted 3 hours. We discussed everything from acquisition strategies to educational programming, from managing controversial exhibitions to building relationships with emerging artists. For the first time in a decade, I was being evaluated for my mind, my expertise, my vision. "When could you start?" asked Dr. Sinclair as the interview concluded. "Immediately," I replied without hesitation. "Excellent. We'll have an offer prepared by tomorrow morning." Walking through Central Park afterward, I felt a lightness that had nothing to do with the October sunshine. My phone was buzzing with congratulatory messages. Catherine Chen had already heard through her network that the interview went exceptionally well. But it was Elena's text that made me smile. Victoria Morrison called. She wants to meet this afternoon about hosting our gallery opening. The Upper East Side is buzzing with curiosity about you. The transformation was accelerating beyond even my own expectations. What had started as a desire to make Marcus notice me had evolved into something far more significant: the resurrection of my authentic self. Victoria Morrison's townhouse was a masterpiece of understated elegance. Original artwork by masters, hung casually in hallways, priceless antiques were used as everyday furniture, and fresh flowers filled every room with subtle fragrance. This was old money comfort, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. "Sarah, darling." Victoria embraced me warmly, leading me into her drawing room. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I'm absolutely thrilled by the possibilities." We spent an hour discussing the gallery opening, but the conversation quickly expanded beyond party planning. Victoria, it turned out, was far more than a socialite wife. She sat on the boards of 3 major cultural institutions, advised several prominent collectors, and had an excellent eye for emerging talent. "I've been following your career resurrection with great interest," she said, pouring perfectly brewed tea from an antique silver service. "Word is spreading quickly about your return to the art world." "I hope the word is positive," I replied, accepting the delicate china cup. "More than positive. People are intrigued. There's something compelling about a woman who steps away from success and then returns even stronger." Victoria's smile was knowing. "Though I suspect your husband might be finding the transition challenging." The observation was astute. Victoria Morrison hadn't built her influence by missing social undercurrents. "Change is always difficult," I said diplomatically. "Indeed. Harold went through something similar when I started my own venture capital fund. Men can struggle when their wives become visible again." She paused delicately. "Of course, the strong marriages survive these transitions. The weak ones reveal their true nature." The comment hung in the air between us, loaded with implication. Victoria was offering more than party hosting. She was signaling her willingness to support my professional renaissance regardless of its impact on my marriage. "Tell me about the artists Elena has identified," Victoria continued, smoothly changing subjects. "I'm particularly interested in emerging talent that challenges conventional thinking." Our discussion of the gallery's vision lasted another hour. By the time I left, Victoria had committed not only to hosting the opening party, but to serving on our advisory board and making substantial introductions to serious collectors. "One more thing," she said as I prepared to leave. "Harold mentioned that Marcus has been quite distracted lately, perhaps struggling with the Morrison account presentation. I hope everything is well." The comment was casual, but I caught the underlying message. Victoria Morrison knew exactly how my transformation was affecting Marcus's professional performance. In her world, personal dynamics and business success were inseparably linked. "I'm sure Marcus will find his focus," I replied smoothly. That evening, I returned home to find Marcus in his study, surrounded by case files and looking more disheveled than I'd seen him in years. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and several coffee cups suggested he'd been working frantically all day. "How did the interview go?" he asked, without looking up from his papers. Very well. They offered me the position. Now he looked up, his pen frozen mid-sentence. They offered. You a job today? The curator position at the Whitmore. I accepted. Marcus stared at me as if I'd announced my intention to become an astronaut. You accepted? Without discussing it with me? What would we have discussed? I asked, genuinely curious. Whether you approve of my career choices, whether my professional goals align with your preferences. We are married, Sarah. Major life decisions should be made together. I settled into the leather chair across from his desk, noting how he'd managed to make even his home office look like a corporate boardroom. When did you discuss your career choices with me? When you decided to take the Morrison account that requires 60-hour weeks? When you accepted the partnership track that demands constant travel? When you made any of the dozens of decisions that shaped our life without consulting me? Marcus set down his pen, clearly struggling to find solid ground in this conversation. That's different. My career was already established when we married. You chose to support it. I chose to disappear into it. I corrected. There's a difference. The silence stretched between us, filled with 10 years of unexamined assumptions and growing resentment. Marcus looked older than his 42 years, worn down by stress, and the sudden realization that his comfortable world was shifting beneath his feet. What does this mean for us? He asked finally, his voice quieter than usual. That depends, I replied. Are you asking about my job, or about something deeper? Both. All of it. I don't understand what's happening to you, to us. I studied my husband's face, seeing genuine confusion mixed with fear. For the first time in our conversation, he looked vulnerable rather than defensive. I'm becoming myself again, Marcus. The question is whether you can love the woman I actually am, rather than the one you shaped me into. Before he could respond, my phone rang. James's name flashed on the screen. I should take this, I said, answering the call. James, hello? Sarah, wonderful news. James's voice was warm with excitement. The Whitney board approved the exhibition. Budget this afternoon. We're officially moving forward, and they're thrilled you'll be consulting. I was aware of Marcus watching intently as I spoke with James, his expression growing darker with each exchange. That's fantastic, I replied. When do we start? Tomorrow, if you're available. I'd love to show you the installation space and discuss our timeline. I'll be there. After ending the call, Marcus's control finally slipped. That's it? You're just going to take on another consulting project without any discussion? The same way you took on the Morrison account, I replied calmly. The same way you've made every professional decision for the past 10 years. This is different, and you know it. Marcus stood up abruptly, beginning to pace behind his desk. This James person. There's history there. The accusation hung in the air between us. I could see the suspicion in Marcus's eyes, the growing paranoia of a man who was losing control of his carefully ordered life. Yes, I said simply. There is history, professional history, intellectual compatibility, mutual, respect for each other's expertise. And now you're working together again. Yes. Marcus stopped pacing and stared at me directly. Sarah, are you having an affair? The question was blunt, desperate, and revealing. It showed how completely Marcus misunderstood what was happening. He thought this was about another man, when it was actually about reclaiming myself. No, Marcus, I'm not having an affair. I stood up, smoothing my skirt. I'm having a renaissance. That night, we lay in our bed like strangers, the space between us feeling vast despite the king-sized mattress. Marcus stared at the ceiling while I read exhibition catalogs, both of us pretending to ignore the growing chasm in our marriage. Sarah? Marcus's voice was small in the darkness. Yes? Are you happy? The question surprised me with its simplicity and directness. I set down my reading and considered my answer carefully. I'm alive again, I said finally. Whether that constitutes happiness, I'm still discovering. Are you happy with me? The loaded question hung in the air between us. I thought about our 10 years together, the gradual erosion of partnership into service, the slow disappearance of my identity into his ambitions. I'm learning what happiness means to me, I replied. For too long, I confused accommodation with contentment. Marcus was quiet for so long I thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "Are you leaving me?" The question I'd been avoiding finally hung between us. Impossible to ignore or deflect. I thought about the gallery partnership with Elena, the Whitmore position, the Whitney consultation with James. I thought about Victoria Morrison's support and the invitations pouring in from a world that remembered and valued me. I don't know, I answered honestly. I'm finding out who I am when I'm not trying to be who you need me to be. When I figure that out, I'll know what kind of life I want to build. The next morning, Marcus was gone before I woke up, leaving only the lingering scent of his cologne and a note on his pillow. I love you. I don't want to lose you. Please don't give up on us. As I prepared for my first day of consultation with James at the Whitney, I studied my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back was confident, purposeful, alive with possibility. She was also someone whose marriage might not survive her transformation. The question was whether that was a price worth paying for authenticity. Standing in our apartment, surrounded by the life Marcus and I had built together, I realized that the answer was becoming clearer every day. Some transformations required destruction before reconstruction could begin, and perhaps after 10 years of accommodation, it was finally time to find out what I was capable of when I stopped trying to fit into someone else's vision of who I should be. The Whitney Museum's conservation lab was a temple of precision and possibility. James led me through the climate-controlled space where priceless artworks underwent restoration, each piece receiving the kind of careful attention I'd once craved in my marriage. The exhibition space will showcase transformation in all its forms, James explained, his enthusiasm infectious as we reviewed architectural plans. Artists who've reinvented themselves, pieces that challenge our perceptions of identity, works that force viewers to question who they think they are. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was consulting on an exhibition about transformation while living through my own complete metamorphosis. This piece particularly caught my attention, James said, pulling up an image on his tablet. It showed a sculpture of a woman emerging from what appeared to be a cocoon of mirrors, each reflection showing a different version of herself. The artist calls it becoming. She created it after leaving an abusive marriage. I studied the piece, seeing my own journey reflected in its fragmented surfaces. It's powerful. The mirror suggests that identity isn't singular. We contain multitudes. Exactly. James's eyes never left my face as I spoke. Your insights are exactly why this exhibition needs you. You understand transformation from the inside. We spent the morning walking through the proposed gallery layout, discussing placement, lighting, the narrative flow that would guide visitors through themes of rebirth and self-discovery. Working with James felt like slipping back into a favorite dress that still fit perfectly, comfortable, familiar, yet exciting in its possibilities. There's something else I wanted to discuss, James said as we concluded our planning session. The museum is hosting a preview reception next Friday for major donors and board members. I'd like you to present our curatorial vision. It would significantly raise your profile in the industry. The opportunity was substantial, exactly the kind of platform that could establish my reputation definitively. It was also the kind of high-visibility event that would make my professional resurrection impossible to ignore. I'd be honored, I replied, already envisioning the presentation. Wonderful. And Sarah? James paused at the gallery entrance, his expression shifting to something more personal. You should know that having you back in this world feels right. like a missing piece has been restored. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with an urgent text from Elena. Emergency at gallery space. Can you meet me there immediately? I arrived at the Chelsea space to find Elena pacing anxiously, while a man in an expensive suit examined documents with obvious displeasure. The tension in the room was palpable. Sarah, thank goodness, Elena rushed to my side. This is Mr. Blackwood, the building owner. There's been a complication with our lease. Blackwood looked up from his papers, his expression calculating. Ms. Wellington, I presume? I've been hearing interesting things about your little art venture. The way he said little made it clear he considered our gallery insignificant. I studied his face, noting the predatory confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. What kind of complication? I asked, moving to review the lease documents Elena had spread across a makeshift table. It seems there's been increased interest in this space, Blackwood said smoothly. Another party has made a substantially higher offer. I'm afraid I'll need to reconsider our arrangement. The threat was transparent. Pay more or lose the space. It was exactly the kind of strong-arm tactic that would have intimidated the old Sarah, the one who avoided conflict and deferred to others' expertise. But that woman no longer existed. Mr. Blackwood, I said, setting down the papers and meeting, his gaze directly. I assume you're familiar with the Morrison family? Harold and Victoria? Something flickered in his expression. Of course. Everyone knows the Morrisons. Victoria Morrison is not only our primary patron, but also serves on our advisory board. She's quite passionate about supporting emerging artists, and has been known to take a personal interest in those who try to exploit them. I paused, letting the implication sink in. I'd hate for her to hear that someone was attempting to manipulate young artists out of their exhibition space. Blackwood's confident demeanor wavered slightly. The Morrison name carried weight in Manhattan real estate circles, and crossing Victoria could have significant consequences for his other business ventures. I'm sure we can work something out, he said, his tone noticeably more conciliatory. I'm sure we can, I agreed. At the original lease terms, as agreed. After Blackwood left, Elena stared at me with newfound admiration. How did you know that would work? Bullies rely on intimidating people who seem vulnerable, I replied, gathering the lease documents. The trick is showing them you're not as helpless as they assumed. It was a lesson I'd learned too late in my marriage. Marcus had never been a bully, but he'd grown comfortable with my accommodation, my willingness to bend rather than break. Now he was discovering what happened when I stopped bending. That evening brought the first direct confrontation I'd been anticipating. I was reviewing exhibition notes in the living room when Marcus stormed through the front door, his face flushed, with anger and something approaching desperation. We need to talk, he announced, dropping his briefcase with unusual force. Good evening to you too, darling, I replied, not looking up from my notes. Don't. His voice was sharper than I'd heard it in years. Don't pretend this is normal. Nothing about this situation is normal. I set down my papers and studied my husband's face. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, tie askew, hair rumpled, a coffee stain on his shirt that suggested a day spent in crisis management rather than confident legal maneuvering. What exactly would you like to discuss? I asked calmly. This whole charade, Marcus gestured wildly at my papers, my transformed appearance, the evidence of my independent life scattered around the room. The gallery, the museum job, the consulting. Work. All of it. My charade? I stood up, feeling my own anger beginning to build. Marcus, I'm working. I'm building a career. I'm contributing to the world in meaningful ways. How exactly is that a charade? Because it's not real, he said, pacing behind the couch like a caged animal. You're playing dress-up, pretending to be someone you're not. You haven't worked in 10 years, Sarah. You can't just decide to become some high-powered art world player overnight. The dismissal hit like a physical blow. In one sentence, Marcus had revealed exactly how he saw my transformation. Not as a return to my authentic self, but as an elaborate performance designed to get his attention. "Someone I'm not?" I repeated slowly. "Marcus, who do you think I was before I married you?" "You were a graduate student with big dreams and no practical experience," he replied without hesitation. "I supported you while you figured out what you really wanted to do with your life." The rewriting of history was breathtaking. I stared at my husband, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in our marriage. He genuinely believed he'd rescued me from obscurity, that my identity had begun when I became his wife. "I had job offers from 3 major museums," I said quietly. "The Guggenheim, MoMA, and the National Gallery. I turned them down to support your career." Marcus waved dismissively. "Entry-level positions, research assistant roles." The Guggenheim offer was for assistant curator. MoMA wanted me for their acquisitions team. The National Gallery was offering to fast-track me into senior curatorial roles. I moved closer, forcing him to really look at me. "I gave up a career you couldn't have imagined to become your wife." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Marcus's eyes. "You never told me the offers were that significant." "You never asked for details. You just assumed they weren't important because they didn't fit your narrative of saving me from myself." The silence that followed was heavy with 10 years of misunderstanding and self-deception. Marcus seemed to be processing information that challenged his fundamental assumptions about our relationship. "Even if that's true," he said finally, "you made your choice. You chose our marriage over those opportunities." "I chose you," I corrected. "I assumed you'd chosen me too. I didn't realize I was signing up to disappear." Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing but now recognized as manipulation, his way of appearing vulnerable when challenged. "Sarah, I love you. I've always loved you. Everything I've worked for has been for us, for our future." "No, Marcus. Everything you've worked for has been for you. I just happen to be useful in achieving it." My phone rang, interrupting our confrontation. James's name flashed on the screen, and I could see Marcus's jaw tighten with recognition. "Don't answer it," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of desperation. I looked at my husband, seeing the fear in his eyes, the growing realization that he was losing control of the narrative that had shaped our marriage. Then I answered the phone. "James, good evening." "Sarah, I hope I'm not interrupting, but I wanted to share some exciting news. The Times art critic wants to interview you about the Whitney exhibition. This could be the feature that establishes you as a major voice in contemporary curation." I was aware of Marcus watching intently as I processed this information. A feature in the New York Times would be career-defining, the kind of recognition that opened doors permanently. "That's incredible," I replied. "When would they like to meet?" "Tomorrow afternoon, if you're available. I know it's short notice, but she's going to press next week." "I'll make myself available," I said, making a note in my calendar. As I ended the call, Marcus's composure finally cracked completely. "This is insane," he said, beginning to pace again. "You're throwing away our marriage for some fantasy about being an art world power player." "I'm not throwing away our marriage," I replied calmly. "I'm discovering whether there's anything left to save." "Of course there's something to save. We're married, Sarah. We have a life together, a home, shared history. We have a beautiful apartment and 10 years of you taking me for granted," I interrupted. "That's not the same thing as a marriage." Marcus stopped pacing and stared at me directly. "What do you want from me? Tell me what I need to do to fix this." The question hung between us, loaded with possibility and desperation. For the first time in our marriage, Marcus was asking what I wanted, rather than assuming he knew. "I want you to see me," I said simply. "Really see me. Not as your wife, not as your support system, not as the person who manages your life. I want you to see Sarah Hartwell, The woman you fell in love with before she disappeared into Sarah Wellington. I do see you. No, you don't. You see a wife who's malfunctioning, who's not performing her assigned role properly. You see a problem to be fixed rather than a person to be known. Marcus moved toward me, his expression shifting to the persuasive charm he used in difficult negotiations. Sarah, sweetheart, we can work this out. We can go to counseling, take a vacation, whatever you need. I need authenticity, Marcus. I need to be valued for who I am rather than what I provide. I need partnership rather than performance. Then let's build that, he said quickly. Let's start over, create the marriage you want. I studied his face, seeing the desperation behind the charm, the fear driving his sudden willingness to change. It's too late for that. It's not too late. It can't be too late. But even as he spoke, I could see that he didn't really understand what had changed. He thought this was a negotiation, a problem that could be solved with the right combination of promises and compromises. He didn't realize that I'd already built a life that didn't require his approval or inclusion. The next morning, I left for my Times interview knowing that the article would make my professional resurrection irreversible. Marcus was still asleep when I left, exhausted by our confrontation and the growing realization that his comfortable world was disappearing. As my car pulled away from our building, I caught sight of our apartment windows in the side mirror. Somewhere behind that glass was the life I'd built around Marcus's needs and ambitions. Somewhere behind that glass was the woman I'd been for 10 years. But the woman sitting in this car, heading toward a career-defining interview, reviewing notes for a Whitney exhibition, planning the opening of her own gallery. This woman was someone else entirely. This woman was someone Marcus was just beginning to meet, and she was someone who might not need him anymore. The New York Times interview took place at the Frick Collection, surrounded by centuries of artistic genius that had survived wars, economic collapse, and changing tastes. Margaret Chen, the arts correspondent, was sharp-eyed and perceptive, the kind of journalist who could smell pretense from across a room. "You disappeared from the art world for nearly a decade," she said, studying my face over her recording device. "That's unusual for someone with your credentials and early promise. What changed?" I chose my words carefully, aware that this interview would define how my return was perceived. I took time to gain life experience that would inform my curatorial perspective. Sometimes stepping away allows you to return with deeper understanding. And now you're back with 3 major projects simultaneously: the Whitmore position, the Whitney exhibition, and your own gallery. That's an ambitious re-entry. Margaret's questions were probing but fair, designed to understand not just my professional resurrection, but its broader implications. We discussed my curatorial philosophy, my vision for contemporary art's future, the importance of galleries that showcased emerging voices. "There's something different about your approach," Margaret observed as our interview concluded. "A confidence that suggests personal transformation, as well as professional evolution. Would you say your art reflects your life, or your life reflects your art?" The question hung between us, loaded with implication. Margaret had clearly sensed the deeper story, but was giving me the choice of how much to reveal. "I think authenticity in curation requires authenticity in living," I replied finally. "You can't help others tell their stories until you're willing to tell your own." That afternoon brought a call that would shift everything again. I was reviewing gallery contracts when Elena burst into our shared workspace, her face flushed with excitement. "The Venetian Cultural Foundation wants to meet with us," she announced breathlessly. "Tomorrow. They're considering a major partnership that could establish our gallery as their exclusive New York representative." The opportunity was staggering. The Venetian Foundation represented some of Europe's most important contemporary artists, with connections to collectors and institutions worldwide. A partnership would transform our gallery from local startup to international destination. "What kind of meeting?" I asked, already calculating the implications. "Full presentation to their board. They want to see our vision, meet our team, understand." our approach to the American market. Elena's eyes were bright with possibility. Sarah, this could change everything. As I prepared for the meeting, my phone buzzed with increasingly desperate messages from Marcus. He'd apparently seen advance copies of the Times interview, or heard about it through his professional network. "We need to talk before this goes to print," his first text read. "Sarah, please call me." "This affects both of us," came the second. "I'm coming home early." "We're discussing this tonight," declared the third. I deleted each message without responding, focusing instead on the presentation that could define my professional future. But as I walked through our apartment that evening, preparing for what I knew would be another confrontation, I found myself seeing our shared space with new eyes. The artwork we'd chosen together suddenly looked safe, conventional, designed to impress rather than inspire. The furniture reflected Marcus's preferences more than mine. Even the books on our shelves told the story of gradual accommodation. My art history texts pushed to higher shelves, Marcus's legal journals dominating. The accessible spaces. Marcus arrived home with a bottle of wine and an expression of determined charm. He'd clearly spent the afternoon strategizing, preparing to deploy his considerable persuasive skills to regain control of the situation. "I brought the Chateauneuf du Pape," he announced, holding up the bottle like a peace offering. "The one we've been saving for a special occasion." "What occasion are we celebrating?" I asked, noting his carefully orchestrated casual appearance, expensive jeans, designer sweater, the kind of calculated informality that suggested accessible authority. "Your success," he said, moving to the kitchen to open the wine. "The interview, the gallery, all of it. I've been thinking about what you said last night, and you're right. I haven't been seeing you clearly." I watched him pour 2 glasses of wine with practiced precision, every movement designed to project confidence and control. This was Marcus in negotiation mode, deploying charm and accommodation to achieve his objectives. "I've been selfish," he continued, offering me a glass. "Focused on my career while taking yours for granted. But that changes now. I want to support your return to the art world. The declaration might have moved me a month ago. Now it felt calculated, a strategic concession designed to restore the status quo rather than address fundamental problems." "Support how?" I asked, accepting the wine but not drinking it. "However you need. We can restructure our finances to support the gallery investment. I can adjust my schedule to accommodate your museum commitments. We can entertain more, build your professional network." Each offer revealed how completely Marcus misunderstood the situation. He was proposing to manage my career the same way. He'd managed our marriage as an extension of his own interests and priorities. "Marcus," I said gently, setting down the untouched wine, "you still don't understand what's happening here." "Then explain it to me," he said, his carefully maintained composure showing the first cracks. "Help me understand what you need." I moved to the window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline glittering in the darkness. Somewhere in those lights were galleries showcasing revolutionary art, museums preserving cultural heritage, spaces where creativity and commerce intersected to change how people saw the world. "I don't need you to manage my career," I said finally. "I need you to respect that I can manage it myself." "Of course you can," Marcus replied quickly. "I just want to help." "You want to control," I corrected. "Even your offers of support are really attempts to maintain influence over my decisions." Marcus set down his wine glass with enough force to make it ring against the marble counter. "That's not fair, Sarah. I'm trying to be supportive here." "You're trying to minimize the threat," I replied, turning to face him. "You're treating my career renaissance like a midlife crisis that needs to be managed, rather than a legitimate reclaiming of my identity." "Because it doesn't make sense," Marcus exploded, his careful composure finally shattering. "You had everything here: a beautiful home, financial security, social position. Why throw that away for some uncertain career in a notoriously unstable industry? There it was, the heart of Marcus's incomprehension. He genuinely couldn't understand why anyone would choose authenticity over security, purpose over comfort, growth over stagnation. Because everything I had here was borrowed, I said quietly. Your home, your financial success, your social position. I want to build something that's mine. Ours, Marcus corrected desperately. Everything we built together is ours. No, Marcus. Everything you built while I supported you is yours. The life I'm building now is mine. The distinction hung between us like a chasm. For 10 years, Marcus had seen our marriage as a merger, his assets and achievements shared with a grateful wife. He'd never considered that I might want assets and achievements of my own. Fine, he said, his voice taking on, the edge he used in difficult legal negotiations. Build your career, run your gallery, consult for museums, but do it as my wife, as part of our marriage. What if being your wife means I can't fully be myself? The question silenced him completely. I could see him processing the implications, recognizing for the first time that our marriage might be fundamentally incompatible with my authentic self. I don't want you to be anyone other than who you are, he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. You fell in love with Sarah Hartwell, I replied. But you married Sarah Wellington, the version of me that fit into your life plan. Now Sarah Hartwell is back, and you're discovering that you don't actually know her very well. Marcus stared at me as if seeing a stranger. Are you saying you want a divorce? The question hung in the air between us, impossible to avoid any longer. I thought about the gallery opening Elena and I were planning, the Whitney exhibition that would establish my curatorial reputation, the Venetian Foundation partnership that could change everything. I thought about James's quiet intensity when, discussing art, Victoria Morrison's shrewd advice about marriage and authenticity, the excitement I felt walking into the Whitmore Museum as an employee rather than a visitor. I thought about 10 years of accommodation, of making myself smaller to fit into Marcus's world, of watching my dreams get deferred while his flourished. I'm saying, I don't know if there's room in my new life for our old marriage, I replied honestly. The next morning, I woke alone. Marcus had left early, probably unable to face another conversation that challenged his fundamental assumptions about our relationship. On the kitchen counter, I found a note written in his careful legal handwriting. Sarah, I love you more than you know. I'm willing to fight for us, even if that means fighting against your belief that I don't see you. I see you now. Please don't give up on us before I have a chance to prove that I can change. The note might have moved me once. Now it felt like another negotiation tactic, another attempt to control the narrative through emotional manipulation. My phone buzzed with a text from Elena. Venetian Foundation confirmed for 2 p.m. Victoria. Morrison will introduce us. This is happening. As I prepared for the meeting that could transform my professional future, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back was confident, purposeful, alive with possibility. She was also someone whose marriage was ending, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet recognition that growth sometimes requires leaving familiar spaces behind. The Venetian Foundation's temporary New York offices occupied the top floor of a Madison Avenue building, with views that stretched from Central Park to the Hudson River. The board members, 3 elegantly dressed Europeans and 1 sharp-eyed American, studied Elena and me with the cool assessment of people accustomed to evaluating both art and artists. Your gallery concept is intriguing, said Giuliana Rossetti, the Foundation's director. But the New York art market is notoriously difficult for newcomers. What makes you think you can succeed where others have failed? Elena and I presented our vision for 3 hours, discussing everything from artist development to collector relations to the cultural exchange between European and American artistic communities. The conversation was intellectually stimulating, professionally challenging, and completely absorbing. We're prepared to offer you exclusive representation for 12 of our most promising artists, Juliana announced as the meeting concluded, along with funding for 3 major exhibitions in your first year. The partnership would establish our gallery immediately as a serious player in the international art market. It was the kind of opportunity that could define a career. There's one condition, Juliana continued. We require our partners to be fully committed, personally and professionally. Half measures produce half results. Her eyes met mine directly, and I understood the subtext. The foundation had clearly researched my background, including my marriage and recent professional resurrection. They were asking for assurance that I wouldn't disappear again into domestic life. You'll have our complete commitment, I replied, without hesitation. As Elena and I left the building, both of us buzzing with excitement about the partnership, my phone rang. Marcus's name flashed on the screen, but for the first time in our marriage, I let it go to voicemail. Some conversations were more important than others. Some opportunities were worth any price, and some transformations required burning bridges to ensure there was no retreat to the old life. As I walked through Manhattan's art district, surrounded by galleries showcasing work that challenged conventions and changed perspectives, I realized that my revenge against Marcus's neglect had evolved into something far more significant. I hadn't just made him notice me. I'd rediscovered myself. And the woman I'd found might be someone who no longer needed his attention to feel valuable, his approval to feel worthy, or his love to feel complete. The question was whether that woman could still be a wife. The answer was becoming clearer. With each passing day, 6 months later, I stood in the center of my gallery during our opening reception, watching Manhattan's cultural elite admire the work Elena and I had curated. The space hummed with intellectual energy and the kind of sophisticated conversation I'd missed for a decade. Extraordinary, Prince Alessandro was saying to a prominent collector, gesturing toward a haunting installation about identity transformation. This piece speaks to the courage required to become authentic. Victoria Morrison approached with her husband Harold, both of them radiating the satisfaction of successful cultural investments. Sarah, darling, this is magnificent, Victoria said, kissing my cheek. You've created something truly special here. Through the crowd, I caught sight of James standing before the sculpture of the woman emerging from mirrors, the piece about becoming. He looked up and smiled, raising his champagne flute in a subtle toast. Our collaboration on the Whitney exhibition had been featured in 3 major art publications, establishing both of us as significant voices in contemporary curation. Ms. Wellington? A young journalist approached with a recording device. Could I get a quote about tonight's success? It's Ms. Hartwell now, I corrected automatically. And this isn't my success alone. It's the triumph of authentic artistic vision over market conventions. The divorce papers had been finalized 2 weeks ago. Marcus had fought it initially, hiring expensive attorneys and attempting to claim half of my gallery investment. But Victoria Morrison's lawyers, provided as a friendly gesture, had made it clear that my business ventures were separate from our marital assets. Marcus's attempts at control had failed completely. As the evening progressed, I moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations, discussing acquisitions, and planning future exhibitions. The woman who had once organized other people's social calendars was now the center of her own professional constellation. Sarah. The familiar voice made me turn. Marcus stood near the gallery entrance, looking older and somehow diminished in his expensive suit. He'd clearly been working up the courage to approach all evening, watching from the periphery as I commanded attention and respect from New York's cultural elite. Marcus, I acknowledged coolly, I'm surprised to see you here. I had to come, he said quietly. I needed to see what you've built. He looked around the gallery with something approaching awe, taking in the sophisticated crowd, the internationally acclaimed artwork, the obvious success of my venture. This was a world he'd never understood but could finally recognize as significant. "It's incredible," he admitted. "You're incredible." I was wrong about everything. The apology came too late to matter, but I could hear genuine remorse in his voice. The past 6 months had apparently taught Marcus what I'd always known, that his comfortable assumptions about our marriage had been built on willful blindness. "I know," I replied simply. "Is there any chance?" he began, then stopped himself. Even Marcus could read the room well enough to understand that ship had sailed. "I hope you find happiness," I said, meaning it. "The real kind, built on seeing and being seen." He nodded, his eyes sad but finally clear. "I hope you know that I did love you. I just didn't know how to love all of you." After he left, I felt a strange sense of completion. The woman who had once measured her worth by her husband's attention now barely registered his absence from her triumph. "Heavy conversation?" James appeared at my elbow, offering a fresh glass of champagne. "Final conversation," I corrected, accepting. "The drink. How does it feel?" I looked around my gallery, my space filled with my choices, celebrating my vision, and realized that Marcus's attention had become irrelevant. What had started as revenge against being ignored had evolved into something far more valuable, the recognition that I didn't need to be seen by him to exist fully. "Like freedom," I said. 3 hours later, after the last collector had departed and the final bottle of champagne had been finished, Elena and I stood alone in our gallery surrounded by the evidence of our success. "The Venetian Foundation wants to expand our partnership," Elena announced, clearly saving the best news for last. 3 more artists, funding for a European exhibition tour, and—" She paused dramatically. "An invitation to curate the Venice Biennale Contemporary section." The Venice Biennale was the Olympics of the art world. Curating it would establish my reputation permanently and internationally. "When do we start?" I asked. As we locked up the gallery and stepped into the cool Manhattan night, I thought about the woman who had sat alone on her wedding anniversary just 6 months ago, drinking expensive wine while her husband celebrated with colleagues who didn't know she existed. That woman had wanted her husband to notice her. This woman had built a life where being noticed was irrelevant compared to being authentic. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Saw the Times review of your opening. Incredible achievement. Congratulations. M." I deleted the message without responding and slipped the phone back into my purse. Some stories end with reconciliation, with hard-won understanding and renewed commitment. This story ended with something better: a woman who had stopped waiting for validation and started creating her own worth. As I walked through Manhattan's glittering streets toward my new apartment, smaller than the one I'd shared with Marcus but entirely mine, I realized that the best revenge against being ignored wasn't making him notice me. It was discovering that his attention had never been necessary for my happiness in the first place. Behind me, the gallery's windows glowed in the darkness, showcasing art that challenged perceptions and celebrated transformation. Ahead of me stretched a future built on authentic choices rather than accommodation. And for the first time in 10 years, I was exactly where I belonged. Not in someone else's story, but as the author of my own. The woman who had once disappeared into marriage had finally reappeared as herself, and she was magnificent. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.